now for our first keynote presentation, Building with AI for Humans, from research engineer at Notion, Linus Lee.
Welcome everyone, thanks for coming to my session about Building with AI for Humans. I'm really excited to share some of our takeaways and lessons learned and my personal ideas and experiences with building with language models at Notion AI. I'll start with a brief introduction. My name is Linus, I'm a research engineer on the Notion AI team, but research less in the UX, user research sense and more in the technical research sense, academic research sense. I spent some time before I joined Notion working with language models to try to understand how they work and how to build useful, interesting interfaces on top of them. And now I do that kind of work inside Notion for Notion's AI products. But a lot of the work in this talk isn't just my work, obviously, it's also the work of everyone else on the Notion AI team. In particular, I wanted to shout out Jose, who's a UX researcher on our AI team, and had some conversations with me that really helped in me putting together this talk and figuring out what exactly were the most interesting things to talk about. I'll begin with a brief history of where Notion AI is today and how we got there. Last November 2022, we released the first version of Notion AI to the world in a kind of preview mode. But the real work started a little bit earlier, a couple months earlier, when we, before ChatGPT even came out, took GPT API, the GPT-3 API, that could follow instructions in a kind of simple way and continue on with text that people were writing. We took that API capability and we thought we'd try to put it inside Notion, since a lot of people write inside their Notion documents. And so we took that API, prototyped the little thing inside Notion that took advantage of that power inside Notion, and found that it could actually be useful for lots of people that do lots of writing in their day-to-day work. And so we packaged it up into a sleek experience and announced it, and over the next few months really tested it out, got some feedback, and launched Notion AI to everyone on Notion in February 2023. And since then, we've learned a lot with how people use AI features, how to design with this new kind of stochastic, sometimes random, sometimes generative, sometimes really powerful technology. And we followed up in May with something else called AI Autofill, which puts Notion AI inside your Notion databases so you can work with large volumes of structured information to, for example, have a log of user interviews and pull out the topics and the keywords and the companies they mentioned, or to have a long list of meeting docs and pull out the agendas and action items from each meeting. For the rest of our time here today, I wanted to share 3 key lessons that I and the team have taken away from building with language models. The first lesson, and to me is the most important lesson, is that generative AI is just the technology. It's not the entire solution. There is still a really large interface gap between what the technology provides, this kind of ask a question, get a response out, or generate text API we have to these models, and the kinds of solutions that are really going to fit really nicely into our users' workflows, their day-to-day kinds of workflows, and whether they're working on projects or writing documents or collaborating with people. And bridging that interface gap, we think, is the most important part of building with AI. A lot of language model products that we see coming out early, coming out today, a common interface pattern that they follow is what I would call a basic chat interface of the type that you see inside tools like ChatGPT. It's where you have a simple input box. It looks like a messaging app. You send the AI message, the AI responds. Maybe you can reference some external knowledge base or some kind of tool. There's a lot of positive things going for this kind of interface. For one, it's very flexible and very adaptable. You can ask the AI for kind of anything, and as long as the response is some textual format or some image it can reference, the model can get back to you in some useful form. It's also quite technically simple to implement because the model already gives you a kind of conversational interface, and the UI is a fairly light layer on top of what the model can do already. In a specific sense, the chat interfaces like this are also quite easy to use, specifically in that most people know how to use a messaging app, so if you put something like ChatGPT in front of users, they'll generally pretty quickly get the hang of what the mechanics of interaction are and how to use that kind of interface. On the downside, in a different sense, a basic chat interface is quite hard to pick up. What I mean by that is that if I put a new tool in front of you and I say, hey, you can ask this tool for anything, it's not entirely obvious to most users exactly what they're supposed to ask for. What part of their workflow does this best fit into? What are the things that this tool does best? How are you supposed to ask for exactly what you want? Maybe you have an idea of what you want to do with this tool, but you don't know how to phrase it just correctly, or you can't think of all the constraints that you need to communicate to the model. And so in that sense, a basic chat interface is too unconstrained, I think, to be super intuitive to learn. And lastly, a basic chat interface isn't as easy to habituate or build into repeated workflows because you have to type in this long message every single time. Given this balance between the strengths and weaknesses of a basic chat interface, a lot of my thinking around building interfaces for generative AI models and building products for them has been to achieve this balance between intuitiveness of graphical user interfaces and intuitiveness of products that kind of over-communicate what they're supposed to do with lots of knobs and buttons, because over-communicating all of these functionalities helps people grok exactly how they're supposed to use the tool and what they're supposed to do, and there's a little more hand-holding. But the more constraints you add, the less flexible the final tool can be. And so on the other hand, we have this need to balance this intuitiveness of very rich interfaces with the flexibility that this kind of loose natural language paradigm gives you. To close this gap that I keep referring to, the gap between the model's very unconstrained, flexible, adaptable format and communicating exactly how that can be useful to people, to close this gap between the computer and the human, I think is the core challenge of designing with generative AI. And some of the questions that people might be asking when they're sat in front of this kind of blank slate language model or conversational model are things like, why is this tool useful for me? Or if in my particular workflow, if I want to accomplish this particular action, how do I exactly express it in words? Or what are some common patterns or keywords that I need to know to get the model to follow my instructions exactly correctly? Something a lot of people call prompt engineering. I understand that this model's good at like summarizing and writing, but I don't do a lot of writing. Maybe I mostly just talk to people and take meeting notes. What can this model do for me? A lot of this is about bringing the technology to the perspective of the user and making the UI communicate for this particular use case, for this thing that you're trying to do. Here's how this generative AI thing fits in with that puzzle. And then lastly, a lot of times the models that we use today are quite stochastic. Sometimes they may work 8 out of 10 times, but the other 2 times it does something quite unexpected. And during those times, the users can feel like, maybe I'm holding this wrong, maybe I didn't communicate quite properly, is it my fault? Is it that the technology is not working well? And that can be also confusing. So to close this gap, Notion has taken a couple of different approaches to try to get the technology closer to the user. So inside Notion AI, what we call the writer, Notion AI inside your Notion document, we have a long list of these pre-built prompts for the most common kinds of actions that people might want to use Notion AI for. Things like summarizing long documents, or translating documents if you have multilingual folks on your team, or if your team is international. Things like a lot of people use Notion AI to fix their writing, improve the quality of the writing, or try to find grammar mistakes. And these are things that are definitely in the realm of writing that language models are very good at. But without these specific prompts, a lot of people might say, I didn't even think of that as a thing that AI could do for me. And so having these prompts built in right there when the user opens up that dialog box is really helpful to try to show, for this particular use case, for this doc that you have, here are some things that I can do for you. And over time, we've really tuned this list so that if you have something selected, depending on exactly what you have selected, what kind of document you're in, where in this editing process of a document that you're in, we try to adjust the ordering of items and the filtering of items so that you see the prompts that we think are going to be the most useful for you. And we think that's made a big difference in making Notion AI feel a little more palatable and help people figure out where exactly this fits into their workflow, depending on whether they're a writer, a project manager, or running a meeting. So when we started planning for how to communicate and bring AI features closer to users, one natural place we went to was Notion templates, where, for example, if you're setting up a project management tracker, we have some AI features, some AI workflows built into that particular template to say, hey, if you're trying to put together this workflow inside Notion, here are some ways that AI can be useful. And this involves packaging this inside the template broadly, but also curating the prompt specifically, the prompt that we give the model specifically, so that the model roughly does what the user should expect to do in this particular workflow. So again, there's this theme of the model can do lots of things, but we're adding bits of constraints here and there, setting some expectations, and then tuning its behavior with prompting, and then bringing that into the context of something that the user is actually trying to do, so that when they bring up AI, they're not asking the question, why is it useful, or how can I make this useful, but more saying, oh, there's exactly this way that this fits into my workflow. The second big lesson and the second big idea that I want to share is that measuring AI performance quality is both a really challenging technical problem and really, really important. One of the most insightful things that I've heard about machine learning as a general discipline from a friend who's a practitioner and a researcher is that all of machine learning is just about getting some number and then making that number go up or go down. And there's tons and tons of techniques for making that number go up or go down, but calculating that number is important. That metric is the thing that determines the success or failure of a particular model. And getting a good metric is really important. If you have a good metric, if you make it go up, your product will do better, your AIs will do the right things. But if you don't pick the right number, if you don't have a clear, crisp idea of what good looks like, that's where the challenges start to come in. And so a lot of our work today involves figuring out what exactly does it mean for a model to be good. And I think there's at least 2 senses in which a model can be really good. One is kind of correctness. Is a language model or is an AI model emitting something that is within the bounds of something that's rational? Like if you're asking a model to summarize some document, is the result shorter than the original document? Is it in the right language? Is it on topic? Is it using correct grammar and English? Things like that. On the other hand, there's also quality in terms of, is this something that's pleasant for people to read? Is this fitting people's expectations of not only something that's correct for what a grammar or a list of tasks is, but is it better than something you could do on your own? And we try to think of measuring these two things in two different ways. On the correctness front, you can usually enumerate what specific things make a particular output for like a summary or correction suggestion for a paragraph, what those things look like, right? A summary has to be on topic, it has to be short, concise, it has to use a particular tone, and then you can take those conditions and write little tests where you take some output, maybe ask a human or ask another language model, does this follow these conditions? And then the output, if the output is good, it passes the test. Quality in a more loose sense of, is this summary better than this other summary, is really hard to judge. And in a lot of cases so far, at Notion, we've deferred to human judgment, to dogfooding new ideas or new prompts or new tasks that the model does within our teams to see if it's useful for us and it works well. And then if we're confident in it, rolling it out maybe to a small slice of our users worldwide and seeing how they respond to it. But we think we definitely don't have the solution to measuring model output. We think this is a challenge that, as in general, the community of AI practitioners and researchers are tackling, and it's something that seems really important for us as a community to try to figure out in the months and years going forward. Now that I've said all of that about measuring output, above all, there's one thing that I've learned about learning how to understand and make models better, which is it just pays off to try to use the models and interact with them a lot and get a lot of like FaceTime with them, for lack of a better word. Models think a little bit differently than humans do. Different models kind of have different ways they like to answer questions and different ways they like to think and reason. And so spending a lot of time with models, just prompting them, trying to give them difficult tasks, seeing how they handle it. In a lot of cases, our team spends a lot of time just looking at test outputs of what models have emitted when we test with them. And then that gives us a better sense of, these are some of the things that the models are good at, and these are some of the ways that the model commonly fails, and that really helps us get a sense of what are the kinds of features that the model is going to be good at helping us deliver to our users. The third big idea I want to talk about today is trust. Trust is important, obviously, and I think trust in the AI world is a combination of two different things. On the one hand, trust is, are you meeting expectations? Do users have certain expectations of security, privacy, of how reliable the AI is going to be? Reliability is particularly challenging for AI right now because these models tend to be fairly random in their output. On the other hand, you have to also set correct expectations. And one slice of trust, obviously, is security and privacy. And there, Notion, like many other companies, go to great lengths to protect user data and follow all the best practices. For example, we've invested a lot of technology in working with synthetic data and generated data so that we don't have to use actual user data of all of our users' protected information to make our models better, unless you explicitly give us permission to. But another slice of trust, and one that I think is less talked about with language models and generative AI, is that for a model to feel like it's something that users can trust to work with, for it to feel reliable, for it to feel like something they can depend on, not only does the model have to reliably generate good outputs, but the user has to be able to reliably communicate what they want. In one example, we had, when we first started rolling out AI autofill features, where you could run the same action on many, many different pages of data, one frequent issue that came up was when you asked the model to make a list of something, like make a list of companies that a user mentioned in these 100 user interviews. Oftentimes, the model would sometimes emit a bulleted list, sometimes emit a comma-separated list, sometimes just list them out in a sentence. And while all of these are individually correct, they don't feel really reliable because every time they're a little bit different. And that's not something that an unsuspecting user would think of specifying in their input. When we think about trust, not only are the sort of mechanical, logistical elements important, but I think from an interface perspective, from a product building perspective, helping users communicate their intent to the model clearly is, I think, also very important. And that can come from instruction. We've shared on our socials and through our user communications how to better instruct these models. It can also come from what's actually in the product. In some cases, we have lots of text in the prompt that sit between the user and the model that say, hey, if the user asks for this, or if the document is this way, then answer in this particular format, even if the user hasn't hasn't exactly specified that format. And I think those little things help set the expectations correct between the user and the model, so that when the model outputs something, it's not going to be surprising, and it's going to be a little more consistent over time. So those are the three big ideas that I wanted to start a conversation about. But I want to get back to the first point, which I think is the most important, which is that generative AI is just kind of the engine of the car. It's the technology. It's not the whole car. You still need to cross this large chasm between, okay, we have a model that can sort of stochastically do helpful things and generate text. How do we make it actually not only useful for people, which is kind of the obvious part, but discoverable and fit obviously into the workplace and the ways that people work with their tools day to day. This challenge of balancing, how do we make something intuitive? How do we make an interface and a product that communicates what it's good for, what it's good at? Balancing that with the flexibility that these models have, that having things like escape hatches, where if the user really wants to do something unexpected, they can do something unexpected. But there's this kind of guardrails around, here are the things that the model's good at that we've gotten our models to do. Here are some custom interfaces for them, some curated prompts for them. These things, I think, go a long way to crossing this bridge between the AI and the human. So we've talked about three big ideas today. The first is that generative AI is more of a technology than the whole pie, the whole cake. It's more the engine in the car. It gives you the flexibility and the intelligence to solve lots of different problems, anything that really looks like generating text or generating output in response to a user query. But that's not something that always pays off to expose directly to our users. Instead, there's this big interface gap that's not just about making this technology useful, but then also communicating how this super general, super flexible thing can fit into specific parts of people's workflows, into specific ways that specific activities that they do during the day. And there are ways to do that using suggestions and templates and customizing these things so that they fit users' expectations better. But to me, that's the biggest takeaway that I've learned, is that this crossing this chasm between something that's intuitive and something that still preserves the flexibility and generality of AI is really important. In addition, we also talked about evaluating model outputs, of getting a better understanding, spending more time with models to get a better understanding of what are some of the ways that these models fail, how can we measure the way that these things fail, and then maybe monitor them. That's a really important piece. And then lastly, thinking about trust as not just security and privacy practices, which everyone should follow, but also about setting the correct expectations and helping the user communicate what they want to the model, using things like maybe prompting extra prompts in the middle, or helping the user understand what good prompts look like. All of this is still an evolving space. We're obviously very early in AI right now, but hopefully some of these things are helpful in helping you and your team think about how to build with AI in your journey. And with that, thanks for coming.